Hi, this is Henry Chamberlain, and welcome to another Comics Grinder. Today I'm going to be chatting with Nick Abadzis. He's a cartoonist, illustrator, artist, graphic recorder, and we're going to be discussing mostly Laika. This is a book that came out a few years back, and Nick should be rightly proud of it. It's a beautiful book, put out by First Second, and this is put out by Self-Made Hero. This is the cigar that fell in love with a pipe. And I just stumbled upon this one. We unfortunately won't be chatting about this book. We'll be chatting mostly about Laika and about making a living as a cartoonist. So stay tuned for Nick Abadzis. Today I'm speaking with Nick Abadzis, who's a wonderful cartoonist. I enjoyed Laika from some years back, and I wanted to have Nick maybe give us a little cook's tour of that as a jumping off point, and then we'll just chat a little bit about the cartoonist illustrator life. Nick, thanks so much for just joining me here and having this conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me, Henry. It's nice to be asked.
I wanted to ask you, could you maybe give us a little picture of what Laika was about, just as a way of introduction, then tell us about yourself too. Just
sure. Laika was it came out in 2007, I think, and it was the story ostensibly of the first Earthling in space, a Russian dog called Laika. Although that's what she was known as to the world, that wasn't the name that she went through most of her life with, and it was loosely a biography of the dog and the human beings who surrounded her, who were connected to her, whose story went untold in the official Soviet accounts, other than including the architect of that great journey, a guy called Sergei Korolev, who was the chief designer of the Soviet space effort. But there are all sorts of other ancillary characters as well. And it's about the dog, and it's about the human beings, and it's about that pivotal point in human history, really. And it won an Eisner Best YA book, I think, in 2008, and numerous other storytelling awards around the planet. It's so sort of deep in my personal past now that it's actually difficult to remember. It's a series of impressions rather than memories, but it's a book where it really does have a life of its own, because not a week goes by where somebody out there who's read it and doesn't get in contact with me and wants to talk about it, or talk about more definitely more about the dog herself, about the life of the dog and the meaning of her life. And it's sort of become a kind of folkloric thing now, like the first Earthling in space, and she was canine, but she represented all of us, really. So that's what that book was about. Yeah, it's it's kind of a signature piece for me. It's definitely the piece that, when I say that I'm a cartoonist, or I introduce myself as a comics writer or an artist or anything like that, and people go, "Oh, what have you done?" And I say, "Have you heard of a book called Laika, the Russian dog?" And they go, "Oh, right," And so it's a nice calling card.
Well, that's right. So I wasn't off the mark, and I didn't think I was putting you on the spot. You did really well just describing it, even though it's been some years back. That's coming from my perspective and from a lot of folks that. So what is it that you're known for? What is it that you're known for? And Laika just popped into my head. Is that really the book that put you on the map, or what other things were you doing before that you could tell us about?
I mean, I think it put me on the map in the USA. And that's really why I live here currently, because it came out and it made a terrific impact here. And we were over promoting it. My wife said, "Can we live here for a bit?" We were in New York City at the time, and we'd been coming and going between New York City a lot anyway, over the years. And myself, I moved about a lot as a kid. My dad was Greek and he was a pharmacist and he got a bunch of different jobs across Europe over the years. So I was born in Sweden. I grew up in London and I grew up in Zurich in Switzerland. Spent a lot of summers in Greece and France and that kind of thing. So, so I had this very European upbringing, but I most often went to an American school. So I was in the American school system, and then a couple of friends moved back here, and that was my first experience of the USA. Was visiting them when I was a kid. So,
so it wasn't exactly a complete culture shock for you when you came over to the United States.
Not exactly, no. Although I think that culture shock is something that kind of goes deeper and deeper as the years go by, and you think, "Wow, I never knew that, or I never saw that before." So,
yeah,
I've been here for 15 years now, nearly 15 years. So, and every day there's always something new that you comprehend about the host country that you live in. We're now American passport holders as well, so there's that, and that's a different kind of emotional investment in the place that you live in. How far do you believe in your host country? And that's pretty definitely 100%. That's the sort of investment you make in a place. But I also think I'm kind of a restless soul, and I chalk that up to being the son of my father, who was born in Alexandria in Egypt, although he was ethnically Greek, and he spoke a bunch of different languages because the lingua franca there was French. So he spoke excellent French, and he spoke all the Latin languages. And then he came to England to learn English because he didn't know that yet, and that's where he met my mother. And he was sort of ceaselessly restless, even after that. And I think that he imbued that quality into me as well. There's nothing I can really do about that. But it makes me adaptable, I think. In different places and comprehend how different people live their lives. And really, at this stage in my life, what you really understand is that people are not really very different anywhere you go. They might speak a different language and have different customs, different local traditions, that kind of thing. They might read a different type of comic, but really, everything fundamentally is very, very similar at a base level.
Oh yeah, well, sure. There's certainly quite a lot of differences in the United States, as you know, as you come to know. I'm just thinking of here in Virginia Beach, people that wonder what could Seattle possibly be like, and I guess vice versa. Have you always been in the New York area? Do you prefer cities or?
Do I prefer cities? If you'd asked me that question even 2 years ago, I probably would have said yes. I don't think that that's really true anymore. I think I lived most of my life in either London, Zurich, which was not a big city, and New York. So it's really kind of New York and London where I spent predominantly most of my time. And London and New York are very similar in some ways, very dissimilar in other ways. Geographically, they're very dissimilar. London's sprawling and vast, whereas New York, although it's got a similar kind of population, is contained, geographically speaking, on numerous islands or corners of islands. I love cities. Obviously, I love this city that I live in now, and I love London, and I love Zurich. They're all home in a different way, different ways, definitely. But I think I'm getting to a point where I kind of need a bit of space and peace.
Yeah,
I think it might be post-COVID as well. I think a lot of us have started to reevaluate exactly how we live and how we want to live and how it's possible to live. And if you're predominantly a freelancer, which I am, I mean, I kind of run an ancillary career here in New York as a graphic recorder, but I don't really need to be in one place to do what I do. And since COVID, neither does my wife really. So, so we're looking at kind of the flexibility of the situation and reassessing that and figuring out what we're going to do next. We may stay here, we may not. We may keep a base here, we may not. I mean, I think it's pretty definite that we will keep a base here, but it's interesting to kind of to look at the possibilities and remain flexible, especially if you're an artist of sorts. You always want new input, don't you?
Oh, sure. Well, you can have some satellite city or town or hamlet. Even Connecticut, which is pretty close to New York. I'm sure
Yeah,
you'll figure it out.
yeah. I hope so. I hope so. As long as there's space to work and people around, not too far. You always need people. But yeah, it's. I mean, New York's a kind of tremendously inspirational environment. You only really need to kind of walk out the door and go into town, and there's always something to see. There's always something happening. There's, you know, tons of museums and events and what have you. You can just walk around town, and it's just one of the best places in the world for people watching. And I am an inveterate people watcher. I love observing people and behaviour and what people do to get by, especially in big cities. You know, that's the, you know, the biggest kind of emotional test tube that exists. And if you
Oh,
like what
God, I
observe,
know.
you know, it's the place to be.
Well, maybe as our conversation flows a little more, something might come to mind because I think about how stimulating and fun it is to be in the heart of New York. Whatever, in the heart can be many different places: the Lower East Side, Midtown, even the more restrained areas like in the Central Park, Upper West Side, East Side. Those can be fun too in different ways. And you see more sometimes when you're by yourself because you can control your movement much more easily than being with someone else. But then that other person can direct you to places you wouldn't have thought to go. And so it's because I think of Koreatown. I discovered how wonderful Koreatown was on my own. And then when I brought Jennifer, my partner, I had to be mindful of what she wanted to do. And then she brought in, well, let's go to the JP Morgan library. I had never thought to do that. So, but anyway, now I hooked into you with Laika, but I also hook into you with what you're doing now with graphic recording, which I find really interesting. I kind of discovered for me graphic recording a few years back when I was in Europe. I think it seems like a more natural thing in Europe, and in America it seems like a little more like a meat and potatoes thing where we're gonna just blow out of the water this whole idea of it being artful. Oh, it's stick figures and it's concepts. And in Europe, it seems like it can be more quirky, and the artfulness seems to be celebrated more. Am I on the right track to think these things?
I, to be honest, it's. I mean, I follow a bunch of different graphic recorders, and I'm friends with a couple back in Europe, back in the UK, more specifically, and a couple in sort of in France. But it would be difficult for me to say. I mean, I've worked in Europe a little bit myself, mostly Switzerland, it must be said. But most of the jobs that I've done as a graphic recorder have been here in the United States or in Mexico, believe it or not.
Oh,
and
really?
a couple in Canada, yeah. But so, but I mean, the way you've just described it, which is, you know, from my point of view, I mean, I sort of see it as graphic recording is a weird thing because different clients always want something different, in my experience. So, you know, one client might want something that's very specific, or they might want to, you know, they might want a presentation. You're sort of an accoutrement of sorts to a presentation, or they want something that they want you to record the salient points of a meeting, of a private meeting. And, you know, you often find yourself signing NDAs before these things, unless it's performative, which is usually the big presentations, the big meetings, the big sort of media circus aspect to it. And they're very different kinds of jobs, I find. And if there is a performative aspect to it, they really won't like it when you synthesize new visual iconography on the spot, or it depends how planned they want it to be, in which case they're like, oh, can you do this? So I find myself very often, there's a huge planning aspect to any of these jobs. And the more planned they are, the more definite the end result will be. It's really, the surprises often just come in in terms of the results of the meeting, the breakout groups, that kind of thing. If you're doing something where you're literally just kind of recording a meeting, then it can get, if I was to define graphic recording, I'd say what it is really is everybody thinks it's just drawing. But what it really is a hell of a lot of listening. You listen really hard, and everything is going through a sort of internal editorial process. And then you're doing the drawing, then you're doing the visual recording, the synthesis, the defining of kind of individual points. And I find myself doing that an awful lot more than I do the actual, sitting down and kind of sketching stuff out. That's almost the last thing that you do. And it's a weird kind of ability that evolved in my case after many years of being an editor in print, in the British comics and magazine industry. So I used to work for a place as a development editor, and what we used to do is have these big whiteboards in a meeting room, and I'd kind of gather in a bunch of kind of like different people who I knew were good at certain tasks. And I'd say, okay, we've been given this job of inventing a new book line or a new magazine based on this character, this license. How are we going to do it? And we just basically brainstorm, blue sky, and throw a bunch of stuff, bunch of ideas out there, and I whiteboard it all out. And in processing that, in kind of firming up a concrete idea for a title for a magazine, say, or a book line, you became very good at pruning it and editing it and figuring out what the kind of through line of any kind of project was or would be, and then figuring you do it all visually, you do it on that whiteboard, and then you'd kind of prepare a document from that. And over time, I realized that those skills were transferable. This was something, as we were becoming a more visually literate society, there were other kind of areas of business where that kind of skill was desirable. And that's how I sort of fell into it, really. I realized I could market that as that kind of editorial and drawing skill and ability to kind of do things very fast and pull out salient points from any kind of given meeting situation and record it. And then I became aware there was a whole industry dedicated to that, and I've sort of grown up alongside it in this country while I've lived here. So I've been doing it for about 14 years now. So
that's such an excellent recap. I didn't mean to say anything at all negative about the industry. I just wanted to have a jumping off point, and I do see I do see it as something of a difference. When I say art, I think that a European audience is more receptive to it, and an American. This is very black and white thinking, but American audience might be a little more resistant, and a European audience might be a little more receptive. But there's a whole lot of good people doing this kind of work, and so God bless them all. I do find that any industry can become clogged up by being an industry. How about we put it that way?
That's ain't that the truth? I mean, it's a living. It's a way. It basically enables me to keep doing comics. I mean, which isn't to say that in any individual job that I do as a graphic recorder, I mean, I hugely enjoy it. I always find it a challenge. It's always a kind of interesting creative challenge where you've got to understand your client. So there are diplomatic skills involved in that, which are all, kind of editorial in from my point of view, they're based in that sort of editorial practice that I learned. I mean, my first job as an editor was at Marvel UK, back when Marvel had a UK office.
Oh,
So I started my career for Marvel Comics, but so I trained as an editor there and went through various, jobs in British publishing. I had a kind of whole career as an underground cartoonist in, British publishing for years, and then sort of, got put on the map in American terms over here with Laika, with the publication of Laika. So my career really has kind of gone through various different iterations, and I've run different things alongside the comics, but comics is my first love. Comics is my true language, if you like. And then I can export all the kind of comics grammar that I've learned and all the things I've experimented with and figured out through comics, and I can take them into graphic recording and indeed any other kind of area that I've worked in, like the VR animation and stuff like that. So it's it's all grist for the mill. It's all good experience that it allows you to sort of bring some new ideas to bear in a new situation.
yeah. I think for some cartoonists, not all cartoonists, but for some, like what you're describing, it can be a natural fit. And it's not, when I say art or drawing, it's not, and that's what irks me when I've heard it over and over again by my fellow Americans is, oh, well, it's not art. Oh, you think you're going to do an illustration? No, let's say there's an art to being a plumber, there's an art to being a lawyer. Yeah. There's an art to being a graphic recorder. And of course, like what you said about the editing, the pruning, that's the magic when you synthesize things. And yes, you definitely have to be listening. And it helps to have a really a robust skill set, things that you wouldn't think would fall into graphic recording. You really have to love to read. You have to love the written word. You have to be a good observer. A lot of things. And it's like a lot of things in the liberal arts, acting or writing, so much of life, so much experiences, they just are inextricably linked in a special way. So the person who has those skills, they could be golden. They could really do well in it. And the person who just stumbles into it and thinks it's going to be easy, that they're going to have a rude awakening. So
it's all storytelling, isn't it? I mean, I think that's the broad church of it is storytelling, particularly visual storytelling in our cases. But I mean, to get back to what you were saying about that sort of, I think that perception you have of Europe being perhaps slightly, I mean, where I grew up, mostly grew up. I mean, I had this sort of privilege in the sense that I was both in Europe and I was in the UK, in London. And when I lived in London, when I grew up when I was the parts of my childhood where I was growing up there, it was at that time very much a kind of case of, oh, you read too many comics. That was my experience in education there. It's like, you read too many comics. And then when I was in Europe, visiting my aunt, my mum's sister who'd moved to Paris, the first thing she did was buy me some bande dessinée, some French comics. And over there it was encouraged. It was seen as stimulating your visual, educating your visual imagination, your storytelling bones. And so I kind of got these mixed messages, and I kind of felt like in the UK in the sort of 70s and 80s, you were very much, you'd look to kind of America or Europe as these sort of twin meccas, and we were this valley in between where that kind of stuff was frowned upon. Whereas over in the in the US, you had DC Comics and Marvel, you had Disney, you had after 1977, you had Star Wars, you had all these kind of, I mean, they've all kind of grown into kind of huge franchise type deals today, but you had this sensory imagination that was very much a kind of progressive ideal, a kind of wonderful way of looking at the future and looking at the future of print, looking at the future of everything really. And in Europe, I look at Europe and I just see these fantastic comics, all these marvelous and amazing genres. And in the UK, we had a bunch of war comics. We had it was all sort of very neatly divided. You had these kind of kids comics for juveniles and these, certain. Then you had kind of, it was all girls and boys, very very binary, very kind of like this demarcation zone. And you weren't allowed to kind of like all these different stuff, or wasn't that you weren't allowed to, but it was all very proscribed,
Mm-hmm.
But in a weird kind of way, looking back, I mean, that's how I perceived it at the time. But I was only a kid. I look back and I sort of think that in a way it was an embarrassment of riches, because we had everything. We had access to all the American stuff, and we did have access to a lot of kind of European stuff as well. And I mean, with the advent of the internet and the modern age, now you've got access to absolutely everything anyway. But back then it would kind of come in through fits and starts, it would seep in and you'd become aware of these different styles. And me being me, I just absorbed it all. I was just a sponge for all of it. And which is probably both good and bad, because it's mean that I've never been able to kind of quite delineate my style towards a very kind of particular market. I'm not really a European artist. I'm not really an American artist. I guess if I don't really know where I belong. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it means that I'm not anchoring myself to any kind of one school or one way of perceiving things.
Oh, no, I envy you. You seem to be in a really good spot, I think.
Oh, thank you. I mean, philosophically, it kind of seems like a bit of a potpourri, but it's I try and kind of bring everything that I know. I kind of try to bring to bear on any new project, be it a graphic recording or a new graphic novel, or a comic of any kind.
If you could, talking about future graphic novels and comic projects, is there something that you've been sort of thinking over the years that you'd like to do, some project, or what could you say about future comics in your future?
Well, I'm working on a book at the moment, which was called Skin Trouble, which let me explain a little bit about the history of that. After I finished Laika for First Second, I signed a contract for a follow-up book, not in any way related to Laika, but the original idea. I had an idea for two separate books, and one was a book, an anecdote about race, which was sort of loosely based on my life with my wife Angela, who is she's Black British, and she's now officially, since becoming American, an African American. So she has a sort of different experience of both of those countries growing up in the UK. Certainly a different view of the UK than I do. And we were both, in a way, children of immigrants. Her parents were Jamaican, my dad was Greek, but my mum was from South London. So, but we both had that kind of immigrant parent experience in the UK. Mine was, I present as white, so mine was very much a kind of a white kid's experience, and hers was a black kid's experience. So the original idea for the book was just to kind of like do something about our dads' lives coming to the UK in the 1950s. And then we had this other idea for a book about an anecdotal book about being in a mixed race relationship. And over the years, when we came to live here, and over the years, long story short, I attempted to, when I signed the contract, first, second, very much wanted it to be a book about migration and race. And I attempted to fuse the two together in the way that they wanted for a long time. And it just never worked. It never worked because I think that they were always two separate stories, or they needed to be given separate treatments, and intertwining them would, to a certain extent, dilute each of the subject areas, being one being migration, one being race. Mm-hmm. Experience, memoir of one's experiences. In the case of the book, as it's turned out, a lot of them is a lot of those experiences are my wife's. So just prior to COVID, I went back to Mark Siegel at First Second, and I said, look, this has never really worked, and I'm still struggling with it. There's a lot of backstory to that as well, and why it didn't work and why I did other projects in between. But skipping over that to get to the good part, I went back to him and I said, what about we just go back to the original idea, which is a book about, an anecdotal book about what it's like to be in a mixed race relationship, except now, since 2016, it seems more relevant. We've got a lot more to say. We've been living in this country for X number of years. We've got a different perception of it. Angela's got a different perception of it. What if we bring her on board as a co-writer and we construct it from a lot of the stories we have? And he went, go ahead, do a draft based on that and we'll talk about it. So I did. And then COVID happened. And during COVID, I was working on a VR animation with a film director, Asif Kapadia, of Laika. It's loosely based on, the Laika graphic novel. But alongside that, I did this draft of Skin Trouble. And then, of course, George Floyd happened, and that got incorporated into the book. I ended up with this draft, and I gave it to Mark, and I said, what do you think? And he went, this is it. We're going to publish this. This is the one we're going to do. So we have an editor on that book now, Francesca Lynn, and I'm drawing it. The script is all pretty much locked, and bar some sort of tweaks on that. It's basically a matter of me getting on with it and drawing it. So that's all happening. But it was a long, that just gives you a sort of sense of somehow how, in my case anyway, how long a project can take to reach fruition. There's a lot more to that story, obviously, but yeah. It's been a really, that's taken 14 years. And I would say probably about 4, maybe 5 abandoned drafts before the 3 new drafts that we did to kind of take to get it to this point of it nearly being done, So it's been a long old time in terms of its evolution and development. But we're nearly there now, I'm going to spend should take me about another year to draw it, and then we'll get it out there.
Oh, that all sounds very familiar, because I went through a process like that myself. The advice I was given was that do the whole book on your own and then present it, because no one will understand your book better than you. And once you show them, this is what I want to do, they'll go, I get it. This is your vision. But otherwise, it's all this give and take and up and downs. But that said, it sounds like what you described is also a successful collaborative effort. And these things that are really worthwhile do take years. So it sounds about right that you could have done it all on your own, or with the input.
That's all of, that's see a lot of it there. I'm just lettering it at the moment in Procreate. It's just a whole huge sneak preview. I don't know if you can see that. It's sort of disappearing in the zoom, but there's all this it's all based on we sat around and I recorded us having conversations, sometimes over a bottle of wine, sometimes not. And we just went through everything, and I kind of spliced in a few bits from kind of previous drafts, but it's a very different kind of book to what was originally envisaged. But I think it's very relevant, very much of the now. It's very much a post 2016 book. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
You know, and the things that obsesses America these days are front and center. You know.
Well, it's quite the title, Skin Troubles. A very memorable title. You can't forget it once you hear it.
Well, actually, it's not going to be called that anymore, and I'm not allowed to say yet what the title is. That's sort of the working title. That was the working title for years, so that's what I know it as.
I see.
But First Second forbade me from kind of like announcing the title yet. So so I'm gonna have to wait on that one. But watch this space. There'll be an announcement at some point when it's at a I think they're waiting for the kind of perfect moment to kind of make a big announcement and sort of say, yeah, this thing's on its way, and it's called Humble Lads. So there's a certain amount of frustration over that, but yeah, I've known it as Skin Trouble for years, and I will probably continue referring to it as that because I can't get used to the new one, and that which in itself was the subject of much debate and heartache, and trying to kind of get something that Angela, my wife, was happy with as well. So Francesca come to that. So it was but we got there, and that will be announced at some point.
Well,
I'm sorry I can't share that with you, Henry. It feels like a bit of a cliffhanger.
Well, I'm so glad that I asked because First Second, you couldn't be in much better hands. They have such an amazing history, and they're always all about quality. And so the ups and downs, whatever they were, that's part of it, and well worth it, I imagine.
Well, yeah, it'll be the third book I've done with them over the years. I think one always hopes to be more productive than one is, but this is also sort of the way things have panned out. I spent a number of my years here kind of writing and creating Doctor Who comics, which was a sort of day job, a very, very fun day job, and kind of trying to do my own little bits and pieces on the side. I've got a bunch of other projects at various stages of evolution as well, which I'm hoping will come out behind this one. But it's a lot of balls to juggle, a lot of things to keep in the air. I know that you're all too familiar.
Well, it is frustrating to be in the mindset to do one thing, and then you have to switch gears and be in the mindset to do something else. It's
the hardest part, right, of being any kind of a working artist, is always having to take a sharp left turn into kind of one project that's demanding a very specific set of rules, and then go into another and just be completely open and have a play, and that's the demands of that project. And sometimes there's a incredible disparity between the two, and that can be weird as any kind of a working writer or artist.
Well, there's so many things a person would like to do in a lifetime. I've only scratched the surface in the world of photography or video. There's just so much that you need to know and understand, and trial and error. So specializing in comics is a wonderful place to be, and it sounds like you're quite satisfied. You're happy. I can see you're very happy talking about your graphic novel, and I'm sure you're intrigued. It stimulates you when you do graphic recording. So it's a nice balance, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I have found in the kind of past year, I mean, there's been fewer and fewer in-person gigs where the graphic recording is concerned. People want me to do it more and more remotely, which of course is it's both it's cheaper for one thing for them. I get a lot of kind of gigs around New York, but I used to kind of travel to different places. I used to get invited down to places like Atlanta and Texas and California and do them a lot further afield. But I think that kind of like big business, corporate businesses got wise to that now, and they'll just as soon have you on a Zoom call like this, and that's a shame because you know you don't get the nuances that you get when you're kind of in the room with the people, and moving out and meeting people and getting to know them a little bit. When it does become a little bit more mechanical when it's a remote gig, but anything like that basically pays the rent to kind of enable me to kind of keep doing comics. I'm happy. I'm very much a visual storyteller, but I love the word, the written word. I love the marriage of the two. I love what can come out of that. But I do think that comics is primarily a visual mode of storytelling, much like, you know, cinema or perhaps TV less so, at least the tradition of TV in British TV, which is sort of derived from theatre, much more so than American TV is. But all these things meet in the middle, you know.
Yeah.
And as I say, I'm a kind of child of different places, so I feel like I'm one of these lucky individuals who can kind of draw from it all and put it all in one new pot and present that as this is a new way of doing it. You know, this is my way of doing it. And please, you know,
I'm going to go off on left field a little bit. You had said that British television, its origins or backgrounds more theater, but American television actually it began very theatrically. But it was theater. It was live theater, Playhouse 90, and all those shows.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. When I think about kind of armchair theater.
Yeah,
that was rolled off script edited. That and the various Alfred Hitchcock shows.
Wouldn't it be nice to go back to that?
Yeah, some of those shows were so well written. They were so well written. You know, those early American TV it was sort of steeped in this kind of beautiful, those anthology shows. I love those. You know, The Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, all of that. Night Gallery, even. I mean, I guess we're getting later there. You know, that's about early 70s, isn't it? But people like him and Joseph Stefano, who's the Outer Limits guy. Geez, he was a genius too. He probably gets less, but all those kind of you're absolutely right.
I don't know if in the big. I don't know if in the big picture it's still too early to do that. Maybe it's going to be another generation or so that'll rediscover the energy of live theater. I mean, you've got Saturday Night Live. That seems to be one of the most beloved and the big exception, Saturday Night Live. And so people do appreciate it when it happens. And occasionally network television still exists, and they will do live theater presentations. It's very rare. But who knows? That might come back. Maybe it's too early for that stuff to come back.
I actually think, I mean, without wanting to kind of make a too political comment, I think that there are certain individuals out there in the realm of politics who have kind of harnessed that.
Oh, that's true.
And you know, and present it back to people, and it's taken hold. It's captured a lot of people, and perhaps they don't realize that what they're seeing is a performance of sorts. You know, it's the power of that kind of live, you know, triumphant live performance is potent, as we know. You know, post 2016. I'm talking in illusions here, but I didn't want to kind of get too political on a podcast about comics. So,
sure, that's a lovely way to just we'll move on from there. I had anticipated meeting up with you at a pub or a cafe, and so this is the next best thing, and maybe we'll be able to do it again in the future in person. This has been a lovely
Certainly hope so.
conversation. I'm curious about your early work. Is any of that easily available, or some of your comics from the early years?
Most of it is out of print, and I really need to do something about that. I've had numerous requests. The thing I'm probably best known for in the UK is a character called Hugo Tate. And I mean, the last collection of that was in 2012. I had it in my head that it was quite recent, but it isn't. It's over 10 years ago. And I own all the rights on these things. And there's various kind of kids stuff, all ages, graphic novels as well, which also sort of grew out of, I worked on a music and comics magazine in the UK, which was called Deadline. No relation to Deadline, the magazine and website over here. But it was a magazine that was started up by the legendary Steve Dillon, who did Preacher with Garth Ennis.
Wow.
That's what he's known in the States. So it was started up by Steve Dillon and another 2000 AD artist called Brett Ewins, and they kind of very much wanted this magazine to be an alternative to the sort of mainstream British comic scene that was around at the time. And that was my sort of personal big break, if you like. And I was very lucky to be mentored by Steve, who became a really good friend over the years. I used to kind of like joke to him that he was my comics dad, even though he was only a few years older than me. But I liked that. But it was a laugh. We used to sort of take the piss out of him about that. He's sadly, no longer with us, and a lot of his friends miss him still. But he was one of these people. He and Brett Ewins, they were instrumental in really opening out British comics. People like them, people like Paul Gravett, who did Escape, Fast Fiction, Eddie Campbell. They were very much in the kind of, early to mid to late 80s. They sort of, between all of them, kind of transformed the British scene from this very staid, sort of, boys and girls comics for children into this kind of thriving kind of market for kind of what would now be called YA, and older, and bringing in all sorts of kind of influences, European influences and American influences and Japanese influences, and from everywhere really, and kind of creating the sort of cauldron that, where all this kind of these new ideas and new stuff could thrive. And I want to kind of credit them all with that, because I don't think it kind of gets talked about on the international scene enough. It doesn't really they don't really kind of get the credit that they deserve, but they launched a hell of a lot of careers, a lot of whom are, a lot of sort of internationally known comic artists and individuals today sort of got their start because of people like that in the UK. And myself included, lots of others. But I can't remember where I was going with that thread, but it was going somewhere. But it was really
among the names that you mentioned there. A light bulb goes off my head. Paul Gravett is still quite a influential person. He's a great comics scholar, and he's quite a supporter of the comics medium. That's an understatement.
Yeah.
Quite the understatement.
That's what he's known for these days. But I mean, remember when Paul and Peter started out, they launched this magazine called Escape, and Escape was one of those magazines. It was a British magazine, but I used to go down to the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, and in those days you'd go there and you'd find maybe the latest issue of Raw. So you'd find that, and maybe you'd find, I don't know, some kind of, Forbidden Planet, you'd find the latest issue of Metal or heavy metal equivalent, or from what heavy metal was derived. So which would collect all these kind of bande dessinée. You'd maybe find the latest Mobius strip in there or something by Philippe Drouet. And then you'd find Escape, which was curated by Paul. And there were lots of kind of local people like Glenn Dakin and Phil Elliott and Eddie Campbell, of course, who really set a new tone. There was all sorts of kind of new directions being pointed to in all of those titles. And I kind of regret. I wish that Paul was still kind of publishing stuff like that rather than. I mean, he's become the sort of scholarly face of British comics to a certain extent, but he and Richard Bruton and many others. There's a great kind of group of people there who are promoting British comics. But it's moved on a phenomenal amount since I left London. I don't know if I belong to that particular group of. I'm sure I do. I'm sure they'd have me back. I hope they'd have me back.
Yeah.
But,
yes, I'm sure.
But it's in a sense the kind of different schools of comics around the world perhaps don't talk to each other enough. There's not enough known. I think there are lots of efforts here by people like, say, Bill Cartolopoulos, who are aware of comics abroad, but in a kind of more sort of overreaching cultural terms. They don't get seen very much. They don't really kind of get a chance to be seen.
That's true.
But I think that's to a certain extent, that's America talking to itself as well. There's such a kind of lot of kind of great stuff happening here, and there's always been this. America's such a huge country, and there's so much kind of stuff that comes out of America that I can't keep track of it all. And I live here, so what do I know? So,
well, I love Bill Cartolopoulos. I know him, and I've interviewed him. I went to visit him at the New School, and he's just a wonderful supporter of all the new things, all new ideas, anything that has not gotten on people's radar. He's seeking that out, and that's what I try to do myself.
Yeah, it's commendable. It's a great instinct. Good for you.
And of course, I love Eddie Campbell. Jennifer, her pen name's Jennifer Daydreamer. She and Eddie are friends, and he was totally embraced by Top Shelf Productions, and they're still around. They're now part of IDW, and so I'm familiar with Eddie's work. He got quite a wry sense of humor, to say the least.
Yeah, that's a way of characterizing Eddie. Sure, definitely.
Well, I think you've got so many wonderful things ahead and opportunities. I mean, you could do some sort of crowdfunding maybe for Hugo Tate. There's all sorts of things you could do just with that alone.
I need to do that. For me, I mean, I've got a huge archive and back catalogue. I mean, I've actually got over there on the floor. I'm sorting through some stuff at the moment to see what I've got. And I am the world's worst own archivist. If I finish a thing, I want to move on to the next thing and not worry about what's been done. But I really should look at getting some of this stuff back in print. Hugo Tate particularly, and various other. I've done various newspaper strips over the years for British newspapers. None of which, I mean, they were all published at the time in the newspaper, but they've never been collected. So that again is another group of things that I should probably look at cohering and putting together. But
exactly.
I'm very bad at looking back. I always like to look forward and think about what the next project is, rather than. I probably need a personal archivist, something like that.
Well,
so,
if I can,
huge paper, go do that.
If I can be of any help to you, I certainly help promote things or whatever.
Thanks, Henry. I really appreciate that. That's very kind. And yeah, I may be careful. I may take you up on it.
Well, thanks so much, Nick, and I'm going to let you know when this is up, and I certainly hope that we'll meet again and keep this conversation going.
Absolutely. Cheers, mate. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And talk again soon.
Thank you.